Hi, and welcome to Person Platform. Person Platform is a new podcast for platform engineers and security engineers, bioengineers, where we geek out about Kubernetes and security. I'm Ori Shoshan, by day the co-founder slash CTO of Otherwise, where we make declarative workload IAM finally easy. Joining me this time is Ian Evans, an experienced security architect based in Australia, which means that it's 8:30 a.m. for me right now and 5:30 p.m. for him, and also that Australia has much bigger bugs than Israel, which we just discussed. So Ian, tell us a bit about yourself, where you're working today, and your role.
Yeah. So I work as a private contractor, typically with financial services, mostly doing security architecture and poking my fingers in various other pots. And yeah, that's probably me for an intro.
So how are the bugs over there? Are they big,
Um,
like I've come to expect? If
well,
you
I
watch
come from,
Australia videos on YouTube, the bugs are huge. I don't know if that's reality.
well, there's definitely a bit of hyping it up, but I come from Houston, Texas, where the cockroaches fly at you during the night. And I find that much more unsettling than the kind of spiders and stuff. I also don't have a fear of sharks, and that sometimes affects
Mm.
people too. We have lots of this.
As long as the sharks are in the water and we're not in the water, it's fine.
One of the reasons to moving to Australia is to go surfing. So I have to deal with our
Right.
phobias.
So, how do you get into cybersecurity? And what led you down the path of, becoming a security architect?
Yeah, so that whole fable of, you go to university and you learn how to learn, and then maybe what you learned is like a stepping stone to the maybe just how to think. And so I did a degree in mechanical and electrical engineering at University of Texas at Austin, which is an awesome city. Everyone should go and see it. It's changed a lot since I left. I went backpacking for a couple of years and then showed up in Sydney somewhat penniless and couldn't really find any engineering work. Mechanical or electrical engineering work, not software engineering. And went back to my IT kind of job, part-time job, which was doing IT at a Japanese semiconductor company. And I found myself in a boutique network consulting firm. They got acquired by MG. And after a little bit, I just went out on my own. And I don't know if it's my mindset to maybe kind of look for what could go wrong, that whole threat modeling ethos. But I found my way falling into kind of security in a general way. And the thing that interested me most is how the increasing level of complexity in the tooling that we had as first generation evolved. And so, yeah, it just kept piling down from a networking kind of perspective into cloud and getting familiar with WAF. And then what's this application development stuff, SAST and SCA and CI/CD. And then here we find ourselves in things that melt brains like Kubernetes. And so I just have found my niche with all that cloud and automation and AppSec stuff.
It's funny. I had a similar journey. It's funny you mentioned learning how to learn in university. So I don't have a degree myself. But when I joined 8200, which is sort of like the Israeli NSA, I did a 3-month-long course. You go through a bunch of different subjects like C++ and Python and reverse engineering and networking. But I always say that the biggest thing I learned is how to learn. Because basically what they do is they sit you down all day, every day. You talk to nobody. You have no internet access. It's just you and Linux man pages. And you develop methods for how to learn things on your own and how to reason about problems you've never solved before. Which is probably the biggest thing I'd learned. So I guess I had a similar journey to your starting from there, and then finding my way to cloud native was basically finding out. I started as like a low-level C assembly style developer, and found out that I actually like backend a lot, and that led me into doing a bit higher level development, going to CI/CD. and that aspect of cybersecurity. So interesting to see the parallels between our journeys, like at a high level. They seem a bit similar.
Yeah, it's always a good like either party or just getting to know someone. So how did you get here? How did you go to get here? And there's always a shared experience one way or another.
Yeah. I think if you talk to people who work in similar fields, you're always gonna find some sort of similarity because um well the path to understanding something deeply, like if you abstract it and look at it from a higher level, it's usually pretty similar. But it's always interesting to see the details, like how different people can arrive at similar backgrounds.
Yeah, and when your backgrounds are different, I was just going to add, if you're asked to explain something or you're just trying to help someone, that's where I think you really test your learning and understanding. Because
Right.
if you're having
Yeah.
like something that they don't have the background in, then I love those moments where you're kind of trying to figure out there's all these things that I can normally just jump to and reach with to explain what I'm talking about may not be accessible to them. So I have to almost think of these
Yeah.
analogies and metaphors of how do I convey an understanding without having them walk in my shoes.
Yeah. You have to like explain the context, all the assumptions that you have when you think about a problem. You have to analyze, is the person in front of me, like what is their background, what is the context they have, and which parts of it should I convey before I get to the main point, and how should I explain it to them. So that really tests your, um, I guess the lower level understanding of the problem you're trying to explain. Like what's, you might be talking about some security issue at Kubernetes, but you might need to explain how something works at the network level to really point out
Yeah.
why it has to work this way. So you have to think, like, do they have the same background I have at the network level? If the background is different, how do I explain it in a way that makes it easy for us to move to the main point together?
Yep.
So on that note, when did you start working with Kubernetes? What was the first time?
Yeah. So I don't know if I'm early or late to the journey. It probably depends on where you're working, but basically during the high side of COVID, I was consulting in a financial services company here in Australia. I was working full time remotely, and
Mm-hmm.
this particular company was going. Their history was quite slow rate of change and releases. The analogy I would give is you get to the end of the bridge, and then you realize you have to start over. The analogy is painting a bridge. The end of it helps when you don't lose a word. And right now, I've done the last rivet. I guess I need to go start at the very beginning. And so I think it was, I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
be held to the 6 months between releases. And they saw their way through this through a kind of mobile first approach, the customer being on a mobile platform, to repivot to what is in the end GKE, GCP, and SaaS services where they don't feel there's value in building it in-house. And so my first real in anger view of Kubernetes and all its glory and gore was GKE about 4 years
Uh,
ago.
yeah, yeah. COVID was an interesting time. I think, like if you
Oh,
ask
Nelly.
somebody how they experienced the beginning of COVID, you'll get very drastically different answers. For me, it was suddenly I can work from home and, it's 100% focus time. So my productivity shot through the roof. Fewer meetings because people weren't used to doing every meeting on Zoom yet. So we were
Yeah.
kind of avoiding it a little bit. And I guess my first experience with Kubernetes was initial confusion at all the new words, and then being like, wait, so they just changed the words, but all the concepts are the same? What is happening? Why would they do that?
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like a bunch of like, Kubernetes has some cool concepts, declarative resources and reconciliation, and specifying the desired end state instead of how you get there. But then they made up some new words, which I feel like they could have done away with, at least partially, to make it more welcoming to newcomers. I feel like now we're past that point, and those new words have become old words. So we're now waiting for newer natives to confuse us again.
Yes.
But it seems like a cycle. I think for big enough companies, you're always going to have the next thing that the company is trying to migrate to. Like, say, a very big bank might have a mainframe and some bare metal systems and legacy cloud. Cloud is old now, and cloud
Many
native.
clouds.
And, maybe there's the next thing that's coming up that we're going to be forever migrating to after Kubernetes.
I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking of that very, very busy diagram that the CNCF has of here's all your solutions in one diagram. And it looks exactly like an icons. And when you look at it closely, you may have experienced maybe 10% of it. And I think, wow, take that in terms of maybe what that solution does and the coverage it provides. I don't know if you multiply it, but, and then all those new words, some of which mean things that already have a name for them. But let's make it really, really cognitively dense to think through, like, how does this packet get from this pod through the network policy, through the service mesh, and then make it really hard, egress the cluster to go to another cluster, then do the reverse dance. Oh God, I need to troubleshoot it.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely a complex ecosystem.
I think it's probably Conway's law. So before cloud native, the tooling that runs your infrastructure, stuff like VMware, and then cloud providers was a bit less democratized. I guess not everybody would be able to build it, and there'll be like more of an entry tax in terms of the technical understanding you need to build something new. So there were fewer tools, and I get now basically what I know the picture you're talking about with all the different open source projects that are part of the CNCF, which is absolutely massive. But I think basically it's a map of the community, which if you're part of the community as a very big organization, then you just like get this huge mesh of technologies which just mirrors the structure of the community. And you just had less of them before, because there was a bigger barrier to entry than open source and the CNCF, which is very welcoming. But I never thought about it that way. My inner cynic just looked at it as like, why so many new words?
Definitely overwhelming, especially to the new, like sorry, that's an overloaded term. How do I get started without going all the way to, is it Kelsey Hightower's Kubernetes the hard way? Yeah, you could probably go that way, but I wouldn't say necessarily the fastest way to jumpstart your knowledge. I mean, it definitely gives you an understanding of the underpinnings by which all of this is woven together. But I don't think it helps you step across what are the things I need to know and what are the things I can learn later with a platform like Kubernetes or Meta platform.
Yeah. I think with Kubernetes, and actually with a lot of relatively new-ish technologies, like even JavaScript, there are a lot of good basic tutorials or tutorials that explain a particular concept, but not a lot of content that teaches you, how is this thing actually used in real life. So there are guides that explain like what is a pod, how does it start, what is a node, all the individual pieces. But what you actually need is somebody to say, okay, if you're a Kubernetes beginner, you should use a Helm chart. You set up a deployment. This is how you walk you through the individual steps. And what that might help you do is translate all the existing knowledge you have into the new terms. Just have everything slot into place in your brain. And then everything else will be much easier. And as the years progress, I found myself, constantly looking for new hires, at the various companies I was at, looking for a way to teach them. And there's still not a very good tutorial. So I've now resorted to writing them myself, just for the basics. How do you get somebody who's an experienced developer, but hasn't worked a lot with Kubernetes? Like, allow them to skip the 2 weeks of fumbling about and, make it a day or 2 days so they can translate their knowledge. So I ended up writing a bunch of smaller tutorials. And I think Kubernetes the hard way is cool, but I think you can, like, as you say, it might not be the best way to learn. Like, I think you can get away with not knowing a lot of that stuff. And I'd say it's not even the important parts. The important parts are, I think, learning the new words and the concepts, learning that a Kubernetes YAML is basically a resource that sits in a database, and there's a software component that, looks at it and looks at the actual states and will make changes. Learning that concept can greatly simplify what happens when I actually apply something to a cluster. Suddenly all makes sense. Anyway, I went on a bit of a tangent. So you've been working with bigger organizations like banks, other financial institutions on security. What would you say are some of the security challenges for an organization like that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of my thoughts are a bit more evangelical, but I think the value for security, instead of just being the workforce that says no or just a cost center, is trying to find value on behalf of your customer, which might in Kubernetes be like a or software engineer, or ultimately the developer who's trying to release features on behalf of a business unit. And so like one of the things that comes to me is being able to translate security requirements away from like the static checklist model of do you do encryption and where's your encryption at rest and where's your secure identity and how do I securely session to this and make sure that I've got SSH properly configured, which of course you never do in Kubernetes. But so it's like evolving and stepping into that field so that you can turn it into like a value proposition. But of course, that goes back to our learning of you need to be knowledgeable enough about the field to then be able to apply your art form, hopefully is kind of like seeing threats and transcribing it into this new arena. So it's like, why are we doing this? What does it provide from a security angle? How is it useful? And how do I pragmatically sequence it? So it's not just this, not always unuseful, but less useful than it could be. So I think it's that approach. I think it's definitely not working in a silo, but more through collaboration, experimentation, failure, a little bit of humbleness to say, like, sorry, what's kubectl? I don't know, or a Helm chart, or an operator, and now we enter into all the bingo buzzword that Kubernetes attracts.
I love that because I think, sorry for cutting you off, but I love the approach of, you're recognizing that a security team is often seen as the person whose job is to say no to things and, psychologically be a team that slows down progress or makes you, find another way or work a bit harder, as opposed to, and turning that into, okay, how do I make work more streamlined, easier? Seeing yourself as somebody who's supposed to increase productivity, be easier to work with, not be a blocker for progress, but an enabler, basically. Because, being the tough guy is the easy way out. I mean, you can do that and you'd be doing your job just fine. It would increase security, but there will be costs for that.
Yeah, and the amount of political capital lost, I think, would end up meaning the benefit is so much reduced that you'll be avoided. It's that whole kind of water flows around the stone. And so, like, if you have the knowledge and you're willing to fail a little bit, then you can take this mode of operating as what are the options I can think of to add to the ones that you've provided so that we can now sequence. Like, what I'd like to have is secure dynamic secrets being pulled, not you stabbing that personal access token into Jenkins, please. So what is possible within the timeline we have? But you have to step to that. And
Yeah.
it's a high, I guess. Yeah.
what's cool there is that the developer also benefits from that, because getting a token, getting into the right environment, that's a hassle. It's manual work, it's error prone, it
Yeah.
requires maintenance. So there is a way to see improvements there as something that's beneficial to developers, independent of security. So there's definitely potential for providing value beyond the security value to the organization.
Yeah, you're definitely winning if you can get the security outcome and you can also frame it as, look at the toil we just removed, and or the cognitive load, because now you're not ever interacting with a secret. You're generating a lot of leverage, but of course there's this investment. And so it's like finding that middle ground of what's enough investment and can we accept, maybe option 2 as opposed to preferred option 1, and then just come back to it and, have it on the backlog of, we did it with sealed secrets this time, but next time we're going to do CSI operator or whatever builds on the next iteration.
Yeah. I mean, incremental improvements are important to have as a path forward, and also incremental in terms of scope. So sometimes security projects are framed as, all or nothing, because the perception is, if you don't solve the entire problem, then you've done nothing. And it may be technically true on some level, in the sense that an attacker only has to find one weak spot and they don't need 100. But something is better than nothing. And often bigger changes should happen in steps, because you can't append how everybody does things, just overnight. You have to take into account the organization and the culture and other things that need to happen. So being able to reduce scope either by what you do, or even just by, we're just going to do this for this one service now as an experiment. And then, the second and third time, the organization has had a bit of practice understanding that and rolling it out. And maybe it's not such a big deal, because conceptually it's now similar to something we've done already. I've definitely seen that with some of our customers, being able to scope changes, security changes you make to a small set of services and start from there makes it a lot easier to get started psychologically. Even if the end goal is the same, you want to roll it out to everything and the amount of work is the same, essentially. So hi, we had a bit of network problems, but now we're back. So I really resonated with what you said about the security team being a team that brings value and isn't just a team whose job is to say no to things. So can you give us a technical example of a situation where you implemented that concept, or how you went about security in a financial institution?
Yeah. So the same place where I saw GKE in full bore was the same place where I was going to tell a little story. So in this initiative of building a kind of mobile platform to not step into core modernization, or basically extend to banking from a certain age group, which tends to use native apps for anything else. Like I tend to use laptops. I don't know about you, but whatever that demographic is, that's who they were targeting. And they're trying to innovate very quickly. So as I said, they're a big GKE, GCP, and where those two don't have native capabilities, SaaS shop. And I was pretty much parachuted in to help with security. Of course, that can be any mission you want to turn it into.
Yeah.
And the very first was situational awareness, which to me was basically learn Kubernetes while firefighting. And I basically jumped amongst it. I might get my definitions wrong, but my term of a value stream is like a collection of one or more squads surrounding a business value outcome. So that could be customer identity, onboarding, financial applications of various types, the actual platform team that supports multiple horizontals. And I was effectively trying to get my head around, when you try and take the outcomes of security, how do you actually implement them in Kubernetes? And so I was talking with value stream, well, basically heads of value streams from a technical perspective, and trying to get my head around how do you do vulnerability management in Kubernetes, both
Mm-hmm.
host, node, and the spinning workload that you care about? How do you differentiate those between the actual thing, the value stream is spinning up versus what the platform team is doing underneath you? What is this infrastructure as code concept in terms of the YAML specification, and how can it go wrong? Service
Mm-hmm.
counts and tokens, what the hell is that? And RBAC, oh Jesus, how do you make a claim out into the cloud via some kind of workload identity and do it securely and hopefully repeatedly? Then we drop into networking mode for network policy. In this case, they were using STM service mesh, logging, secrets, gatekeeper, Rego, and not only building
So many
applications.
things.
Yeah, a lot. And a lot of cognitive load. My brain was definitely exploding. So I felt very much for the developers trying to wrangle some of the, like, do all the security checks, please. Maybe you figure it out. And the application workloads were quite testing as well, because it was COT software that would be spun up, not necessarily built for Kubernetes ecosystem, more built for bare metal or VM, but there's a big difference between something written for one versus the other. Like, how does a health check know how to spin this up and in what sequence?
Exactly.
So we've got obviously the in-house stuff that was mostly Golang, and then just to cap it off and make it harder, Windows-based containers. So we had one COTS vendor,
No,
and the decision, this is where it
no,
becomes
I
fun.
love Windows.
I love Windows. I don't love Windows when it's effectively beta in GKE and you're having to spin up the biggest nodes that they have just to get the thing to start, and then realize actually a lot of the native capabilities that exist in Linux-based Kubernetes don't necessarily exist in Windows-based Kubernetes, the like of what we're living now in eBPF
Wow.
and predecessor. So it was
Yeah.
basically parachute in, situational awareness. Okay. And now I'm starting to see the forest from the trees. But that was, I have to admit it, months of hard meters, trying to figure out what is all of this. And then, to my aspirations, provide value to poor devs and software engineers just trying to get their features out, to give that pragmatic
Yeah.
series of steps. And sometimes answer the question, where do I start? Like, what's the first thing I should get right before I do anything? Because another, I guess, misstep is do everything, and therefore either do nothing or do everything really, really bad. So I hope that kind of gives you
Exactly.
a
Yeah.
full throttle, both barrels, fire hoses open kind of approach, all remotely as well. So it's fun.
Challenging, but fun. Yeah. It sounds fun to like get parachuted and then while you're under fire, basically, you're trying to figure out, okay, what's the best place to start? How do they work? Like, what is the best way I can assist with just getting started?
Yeah. And as you were speaking, I was thinking, and win trust remotely, because we're all on screens. You're not really necessarily sure, is the person you're speaking to a grunt and someone that you can just be really frank with, or are they actually a senior leader within this ecosystem? Building that rapport takes time as well. I definitely made mistakes, that's for sure, across the board. So a little bit more in terms of like what the ecosystem evolved to be is, so we had a developer experience team, and they were taking some of the capabilities and making them simpler, typically in pipeline-based format. So you might have like a software component analysis tool. Probably shouldn't name vendor names, but some of them, at least early on, they're a bit creaky or really complex. 40 parameters that you need to get right with an SCA tool, at least in the first generation of which language is
Yeah.
this for, what package manager is in play, what version of the package manager. And then now I need to make this thing that was never designed for branch awareness to operate in a branch aware ecosystem.
Yeah. To basically add it on top of it using complex configuration.
Well, and that was, so some of the goodness was the the developer experience team said, no one wants to deal with this directly. So we'll wrap it within a Golang wrapper and allow people to have basically simpler experiences, and then step into the challenge of managing what they've just stepped into. So what I mean by that is, in a cloud-based ecosystem, you're typically working with containers. So you're wrapping something like a Java jar, which is this scanner, within Golang to hide all its complexity. But now I need to, I think, build one of them for each scan type, because if I let everyone figure out which version, package manager, and
Yeah,
deal
that's a
with
lot of
it,
manipulation.
yeah, hopefully I'm giving it like a good kind of terrifying experience of, wow, there's a lot of complexity here. How to get on top of this?
Especially when you scale it out. Like you can teach one person how to do this, 10 people, but like if you want to scale it out, it needs to be a lot, the golden path needs to be a lot easier.
And
Otherwise, you're basically saying, I'm fine when people don't do it this way, because some people won't.
yeah, sorry, I'm just shutting the door while it rains. Sorry
I
about
hope
that.
it's not raining massive spiders, though.
They come on
I mean,
balloons.
that, what?
Yeah, so it definitely was improving, but it just kind of gave a sense that it wasn't just the security team that was struggling. It was kind of the developer experience team who was trying to make it simpler for software developers to get their job done and prove what good should look like. Meanwhile, a lot of developers had to quickly learn what is kubectl, Helm, customize, all of that stuff. My observations at that point were everyone's copying and pasting random bits of stuff and trying to learn as quickly as they can. Um, and sometimes people just do it their own way, and others like look in someone else's repo and copy and paste what they've done of, so how do I start a repo so that I can basically deploy my workload, hopefully build it and have some checks in place and sequence all this. So I just thought this is crazy. We can't expect, if it took me 2 weeks to take a new resource like a software developer or engineer of some type, here's all the stuff we need to do and kind of look at and work at the lowest level. We have to make some of this simpler. And so one day I had I remember this really clearly, a meeting with the acceleration team. I thought,
Is that like that developer experience team, basically?
it was, I honestly don't know if they had a defined mission statement, but I think the analogy makes sense of they were trying to give people a way of solving problems at scale. And so you probably already know that, well, sorry, you would definitely know, but you can empathize if everyone's working in code and then jumping into clusters to kind of describe what have we done,
Yeah.
what worked, what did we get wrong. It becomes overwhelming in terms of all the checks when you write scripts or just manually jump into clusters. Did we get this all right? Or like, does network policy, is it basically just off because we had a typo and it didn't apply?
Yeah.
How does this work across namespaces? Okay, I've got that. Now, how do I do service mesh from an access control perspective? Okay,
Yeah.
where I'm going to do authentication and authorization. And then I'll be quiet for a sec and let you ask questions. This acceleration team had figured out a declaration language that I believe they copied it from another open source project called Sizzle, SYS. And it was effectively what you do in Kubernetes to define what you want to have happen, but a layer above it so that you could define, I want one endpoint that is going to have these REST API qualities, which will code gen out an open API specification. And I want to have a relationship between this and another endpoint, which might be in another namespace or in another cluster. And the first scratching version of this was, so we declare all of this, and now we're going to render a diagram. And it was like a eureka moment for several teams go, this is how it works in Kubernetes. You know, they just haven't been able to
Nice.
agree to a diagram. And unless you want to spend your life in like Kubernetes logs, kind of go like, okay, how many things did this touch before it got from A to B? They now had a visualization so they can all be on a common page, because it's very difficult when you're jumping between like
Yeah,
18 to YAML. How can we all be on a common page to communicate? Ah,
exactly. Yeah, I think you're touching on a really good point, because even if you say you can teach everybody in the organization, all the different kinds of configurations and network policies and deployments, and everybody understands it perfectly. It's not just about how you configure things; it's also the semantics of how they work and interact. I like the point where you said you have to look at like 13 different resources to understand what something is actually gonna do. And by taking the abstraction one level higher, you can describe the actual relationships and what's gonna happen, and then render that into all those lower level abstractions. Which Kubernetes abstractions are most of them are pretty high level, but I think crucially some of them they're not all at the same level of abstraction. So a deployment resource, I think, is, at least in my mind, is at a different level of abstraction than a network policy resource. So a network policy is maybe closer to like a list of IP tables rules. It's more at a network level of abstraction, even though you have selectors and all that. You're basically asking the person writing it to understand the semantics of the network, the actual enforcement. Whereas deployment is a bit higher level. You're saying, I want, 5 replicas of this thing. And to understand how two apps are gonna work together, or, an entire ecosystem of apps, you have to bring all that in together in your mind and reason about it. And that's just so much that it makes sense that, taking a specification that explains the interactions and then can render it visually would help people get on the same page, because now all of a sudden they're speaking in much simpler language. Like if you're trying to say, okay, we have a deployment and then we have a network policy and a service mesh and then we have a gateway, then that's a lot to communicate and explain to somebody else, and then to hope for them to have not missed any detail or understood it differently. That's a very high bar for getting on the same page. And it sounds like using something like Sizzle, you can describe the relationships, and then that's a much lower bar for communicating the same concept to another person.
yep, absolutely. So the vision that I lobbied heavily with them was, so because the first intent, it didn't necessarily do any rendering into Kubernetes manifests or Terraform, which sometimes you need both, or the equivalent of Terraform, pick your choice, take your choice.
Mm-hmm.
But I could see, because they're already doing cogen for things like, well, how do we scaffold a container? We don't need to have everyone writing Docker files or even Helm charts. What if we were to auto generate some of that? And then I'd kind of snuck around to the corner and started whispering, saying, it'd be really cool. And I know I'm adding stuff to the truck as you're driving around. Could we add to this an ability to kind of like get all these things that you almost need the specialist in the room to get it right? Or if someone copies and pastes it, what if they're copying and pasting the wrong thing? Because it's not standardized and
Yeah.
effectively generated on your behalf, none of it is guaranteed to be homogeneous,
Mm-hmm.
and that makes this work
Yeah,
harder.
that's where you end up with a lot of guardrails type products and solutions. I think if you're in a situation where people know what to copy paste, where to copy paste from, you're already in a pretty good situation relative to many organizations where people will just make up some stuff, which is fine. It's just the best they can do in a situation. So if they know what they need to copy paste, that's already great. But sometimes there are some things you don't want them to copy paste into any context. So say for a bank, the ledger service is not the same as the logging service, and you might have different validations or even internal compliance requirements for how you deal with those two services. So if you have a copy paste based engineering, then basically you need validations. So that turns into the technical version of a team that says no to things. So you try to apply a manifest to Kubernetes, and then a validation goes. Computer says no. Like in the Little Britain skit show, there's a skit where the computer says no.
Mm-hmm.
Problem with that is now it's you and the computer, and you have to figure out like, where did I go wrong. But I thought I was actually following the golden path. Turns out it wasn't. If people describe what they need at a higher level, then you can render it out differently, like you mentioned, to Terraform or Kubernetes, depending on the context, instead of having them basically do the rendering themselves by copy pasting or writing it, and then you tell them, no, you got this bit wrong, you can't do this here. Or worse, which in some organizations there's no validation. The validation is a meeting that you have to have, which is the slowest form of validation.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this started building a fair amount of momentum. The acceleration squad, I think, loved and hated me for coming up or promoting a agenda for them that saw them becoming much more important to allowing us to stand above a lot of this complexity and non-standardization, with an idea that, well, as long as their framework allowed open PRs to be raised of, hey, you don't cover this use case, how can I get it supported? So that the next person that comes along, all they have to do is say of type Postgres or, anything like that. And all that stuff just happens for them. They don't have to work 2 layers deeper. Ideally, the of type Postgres has had 3 people on a day look at, okay, so what are the things that need to be true or disabled to make this reasonably secure so that we can stand above all that complexity?
Yeah.
Then
having same defaults. Then.
yeah. And this is where the story ends up very interesting. As we were building some momentum, another value stream had created their own CLI and had effectively displaced this approach. So whilst they still took an approach of, we will take it. So what are some of the good things that they had that we hadn't yet approached? One was, tell me the type of workload you're trying to build in very plain English. And so it would literally have drop downs of type this, and it would then go pre-scaffold your repo, your branching strategy, give you a README of how to start, and start up your workload with effectively a dummy hello world that said, I was here, and drop logs. And it would give all of that in deep links so that, you just built a whole pathway on behalf of them. And it was interesting because they had taken a different approach and it had gained more momentum without, in a big enterprise, we couldn't discover that, oh, actually, we're solving the same problem slightly from different angles. And that became the default that took over. I don't know if it actually maintained the auto render diagram. That was one of the biggest eureka moments I had. I hope so. But in the end, that's what took over in that ecosystem. And we just didn't know about each other. Funny.
Yeah. Well, I imagine there's a bit of luck that's involved in a big enough organization. So you might all be wanting to be in sync about where the organization is taking things, but it might not always happen organically. And also, I guess people will take whatever solution is offering the, least resistance at the time. So I think that's probably, it sounds like that's probably what happened, because, you could run the CLI already and use it. I wonder, so something that I've found from our customers that is pretty important. So having a golden path and a tool that makes things easy is important, but something else I've found is important for those tools to succeed is to have an escape hatch. So you have a common refrain for a tool that solves one problem very well is what happens about the remaining 1% of cases it doesn't solve. And, you might get curmudgeons, basically, who will tell you, but what about this and what about that? So you got to have an answer for that. And it's important to be able to, go out of the abstraction and go down to the lower level in some cases. And the way I see it, the value of the abstraction is making life easier, but you still need to essentially be able to do 100% of what you did before, even now with the abstraction. Otherwise, you're going to get people going around it in ways you don't expect. If you don't give them a path, they will find a somewhat worse path because they have to. Basically, it sounds like the CLI approach took off, but it sounds similar in many respects. It was basically a blueprints-based approach, conceptually pretty similar, and was just built in parallel.
Yeah, and so the outcome is identical, and it actually had enhanced features. It was just interesting how an organization can be so big that it's actually solving the same problem different ways, which through experimentation you would have typically sequentially. We were just doing it in parallel, and we didn't know about each other until we ran right into one another. Actually, yours looks better for the stuff that we need faster. Okay. Hopefully they added the diagramming tool later so that people could reason about what they had built scale.
I think it really helps. We see, how teams using Honorize are using the mapping capabilities in ways we didn't think people would. For example, so we basically have a dependency map and a map of which services communicate with which other services and resources. And we thought the main use for that is basically access control and troubleshooting access. But we've actually seen some teams use that as just a dependency map, for example, to figure out which teams to wake up when there's an incident and you have like a cascading failure, and to basically auto-investigate what is the root cause and only wake up that person who's on call for that service instead of 15 affected services, which with a normal solution you might do.
Yeah. I was just going to say, you just reminded me of a small project we spun up. We couldn't figure out a way of mapping our actual reachability within clusters and across clusters without effectively jumping into pods and effectively what services can I hit, and not get fooled by things like Istio saying, yeah, you can talk, but you can't actually get to me. And so we actually built a scaffolding system that would jump into each and every namespace and try and render what it could reach through that cluster by just its, the service definition. And then when it went out of Istio, we'd have to know, well, what are all the names of all the clusters and all the ingress points? Because sometimes you have only one ingress and sometimes you accidentally have 8. All of those, and then bifurcate across the branches of all the namespaces that might be behind them. And we found all sorts of interesting things. It took a long time. We wrote some horrible code. I didn't code. The pen tester was like, you can't look at the code. I'm just ashamed by it. It was like, mate, if it gets the job done, it doesn't matter. And we found all sorts of really valuable things. Like, it's kind of like poking in people's eyes saying, did you know that this can talk to this? But that's what the kind of like observability should give. It sounds like you guys have come up with a similar capability, but maybe for a different outcome. We were obviously just concerned. We don't know what mistakes we've made, so let's just figure out who can talk to what, and then
because you gotta know what your exposure is in order to even analyze where are we. Is there anything we need to attend to, and that is just a bomb waiting to go off, or are we actually fine? And to get there, you first need visibility and observability. I think nowadays the cybersecurity industry has done a lot of work on that. I think every cybersecurity product has some sort of visibility feature because of how important that problem is. But I think now that the problem has shifted from how do we know what our posture is, so with all the CNAPs and CSPM type products, to doing effective remediation. So the problem has shifted from determining the posture, which we have a better answer to nowadays, to how to actually remediate. When remediation, when it comes to working with developers, can actually be a pretty complex endeavor. So you might tell a developer, hey, here's the minimally privileged AWS IAM policy that you need. Somebody has to figure out like how to change the actual Terraform specification, because it's not a greenfield project, right? The service already exists. It's running. It's deployed in multiple environments. Now somebody has to go and figure out what actual changes to make in order to apply that. And doing that at scale is, again, complicated for all the reasons we talked about. So we're approaching on the end of the episode.
Oh,
Well done. We survived massive spiders, connectivity issues, rain.
thunder.
Yes. So is there a hot take on something that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I reckon like beyond the evangelical of security needs to be an enabler, and not just the here's our risk and walk away, but almost work from a perspective of anything we hand to a team. To your point about mitigations, we should have essence of understanding how much work we're asking someone to do, because ultimately security will be asking people, hey, I don't want you to work on something else. I want you to fix this. And if it's, dependencies are a thing that are easy to make fun of here's 20 things that apparently to the CVSS scoring are criticals and highs. Go do that. Look for those leveraging positions where you help someone say, and only one of them matters. And obviously you can throw humans at the problem of, well, it looks like that that module is reachable because it's loaded in the class path, but it's not really perfect as to whether it's functionally reachable.
Yeah.
But it's better than just saying, no, you have to fix all 20 as per SLA.
Yeah.
Look for those things that matter most, and hopefully across the spectrum of problems. Don't just give them 7 different fire hoses of, here's all your vulnerability problems, and you have your SLA to fix it. Here's all your, what you're talking about with the, I would call it workload identity within Kubernetes, that although we didn't help you figure out how to do least privilege, you need to go make it least privilege. These are the secrets that we see, maybe or maybe not are clear text secrets, but it's over to you. Like link those things together by some mechanism so that hopefully it's fix this pen test finding, that dependency, we're not sure, or actually we have a tool or we're looking at a tool that helps you gain that context of that's the one that matters, so that, you're enabling them to focus on the most important things, not just here's a haystack
Yeah.
and your shovel. Good luck. And I don't care.
Yeah. Because fixing the problem is usually high cognitive load, but also if you give them a ton of problems and you're basically asking them, now go and figure out what's more important, what's more urgent, how you're prioritizing this against your other tasks. That's also a high cognitive load problem and potentially a bigger one, because you're basically taking the engineers out of what they know to do. They know how to solve the engineering type problems. They're used to that. But if you then ask them, okay, now put on a security hat and figure out, out of these 40 problems, which one you're going to be solving now, which one you're going to be solving next sprint. And it's a big cognitive load, because you're asking them to shift context from their day-to-day job to a security role. And by prioritizing it, as you say, you're taking all that away. You're just saying, okay, look, this is what's really important. And then they don't have to think about how they prioritize things and, what are the security priorities. That's a known quantity. And then they just need to figure out how to execute, which is what their day-to-day is. And so that's a much lower load, even if the actual fix is complicated.
Yeah. But I find it still, maybe it's a bit of a tangential comment, but being willing to threat model with a squad that you're trying to help at this level and say, okay, so we've got all this tooling and telemetry. What have we missed? And being able to, like, for example, draw up a diagram of what could have gone wrong or what has gone wrong, but we're not sure because we don't have guardrail or something else. To that point is like, how do you know that no other namespace can reach you? You keep saying that you're isolated, but there's all this stuff in Kubernetes that seems like funky plumbing that you can squirrel through. How would we
Yeah.
prove that you're actually unreachable except from you to your persistent data store? And I think being able to step into, again, maybe a little bit of ignorance is like, oh, okay, what's this namespace and how does that relate to network policy and service mesh? Can you just explain it to me? I think having three people argue about actually how it works, if you don't have something that renders the kind of like graph of relationships, that's probably beneficial in itself.
Yeah. And it is a very complicated question. Like even just network policies, I've been looking at network policies for years now, and I still get confused sometimes. The network policy that denies everything
Yeah.
and the network policy that allows everything, visually, they are very similar, only a few characters put them apart. And there's all sorts of confusing semantics, and that's just like one aspect that you need to consider. If you have a service mesh, you're adding a whole different party using cloud resources, using databases, and there's all sorts of exceptions to all of this. Like I found out recently something that I never realized or heard of is that there's actually a proxy resource in Kubernetes. Like pods are a resource and deployments are a resource. There's a resource called proxy, which you can use to send requests from the control plane to any service in the cluster, which on a network level, the way that looks like is the control plane, which in GKE or AKS or EKS is not a pod in the cluster, is sending an incoming request. It's kind of a weird thing because it's usually in the pod network, but it's not a pod. So it's like a special case that can often, something you might do to only allow internal access within the cluster is to allow all traffic in the pod IP range and reject everything else.
Yep.
Unfortunately, that also includes the control plane, which under any other circumstances will never send a request to anything. So there are lots of gotchas everywhere. And yeah, if you can't render it, if you don't have a tool to help you, that's really hard to do just in your mind. Even if you somehow have perfect knowledge of everything, which you probably don't.
Not at the rate that Kubernetes is released and all these features growing.
Yeah. And it's just, it's a lot of incremental changes at this point. So, what's next for you? In life, professionally, I don't know.
So, like, it's always a juggle when you have kids and work and life. So you try and find the best
And
balance.
spiders. Don't forget the spiders.
Gotta let go of the spiders. Look, I'm trying to be better at, like on the professional side, I'm trying to be better at not being too harsh with myself, being okay with admitting vulnerability of things I don't know or mistakes I've made, being open to connect more with people at the workplace as opposed to, that facade maybe. And I was going to plug someone who hasn't been asked to be plugged. I'm attending an online course from platformengineering.org on platform engineering. And
Shocking.
it is incredible from a perspective of how non-technical some of the conversations are. I'd really recommend it. Things like the concept of what is the culture change when you're trying to standardize just to be able to get more done and end debate, and how does that work in different parts of the globe? Namely, in LA, you might have kind of the hero software engineer mentality, but maybe in Brazil, it's a very much more hierarchical approach. And so I've been really enjoying it, not only to learn stuff that I definitely didn't know, because platform engineering is kind of like a thing that's getting defined more and more as we go, but for the non stuff as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. Actually, I'll check it out myself, and I'll put a link in the description for anybody else who wants to check it out. I guess it makes sense that a lot of the content isn't, strictly technical. because platform engineering is just as much about the people that are working with the systems than it is about the actual platform. So that the purpose of the platform is to figure out how to best help the people. And to do that, you have to understand how the people work today.
And what's their pain?
Definitely. So if somebody wants to get in touch with you, how should they do that?
Look, I'm stepping away from social media, trying to be a good role model for my kids. Best way is to ping me on LinkedIn, and I'll definitely respond.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ian. It's been super interesting. And it's been a pleasure talking. And I hope it doesn't rain much more.
Thanks. Thanks very much for giving me the opportunity. It was good fun.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
See you.